It is. It is. And the instruction that you propose that I give is 400.020. 020, correct.
Just 20.
And the state opposes that as instruction, correct?
Yes, certainly correct.
Well, if you like.
Come on.
I've considered this. Actually, that's why I'm a little delayed here. In the Carruthers decision, which, frankly, there's very little, there's no case law on this. We're breaking ground. I'm trying to rule fairly to your client, but also in accordance with the law. The Carruthers decision, the concurring decision, talks about the statutory provision for conducting a mental health examination and notes that evidence obtained during that cannot be used for the purposes as you're seeking to exclude. But the concurring opinion also states that the alternative manner, that would be Rule 25, contains no such restrictions. Applying that finding, which I agree with, Rule 25 does not limit what can be used or not used. And finding that the examination of your client was conducted under the auspices of Rule 25. As evidenced by the state's motion, I'm going to deny the request to give the jury the instruction requested. And I'll show that over your objection.
Now we have a continuing objection on that very issue.
Yes, sir.
With regard to Dr. Frank's testimony and the possibility of Dr. Dean's testimony.
Yes, sir. That's how I was interpreting it.
And we can make a record once we get to the final instruction conference regarding that as well.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Mr. Pash, I wasn't trying to cut you off, but knowing how I was going to, do you wish to supplement?
No, I can make the record I need to make when we have the instruction conference.
All right. But that, my ruling is, and again, is because this was consented to under Rule 25, that the restrictions contained in Section 552 are not applicable, and therefore the instruction itself is not required, subject to a continuing objection by the defense. Are you going to call Dr. Franks?
We are.
All right. And this is just for housekeeping purposes. Do you think we'll be finished today?
Yes, I do. I can't speak for anybody else, but I do.
Okay. All right. Are we ready for the jury then?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Barry, are you ready? Yeah. Okay. Yes, sir. Please be seated. Thank you. Mr. Barry, do you have another witness?
Yes, Judge. I call Dr. Kent Franks.
Dr. Franks, come on up. Afternoon. Have a seat, okay? And then I'll swear you in once you're situated. You solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give and the cause now pending before the court will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Thank you. There's not a lot of room there. If you want to set things there, that's fine too.
Thank you.
However it's easiest.
Please tell us your name.
Kent Wesley Franks.
And can you tell us how you're employed?
I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm in private practice.
And how long have you been a clinical psychologist?
Obtained my PhD in 1987.
What is a clinical psychologist?
Clinical psychology is the study of behavior.
And how does one become a clinical psychologist?
Well, it entails an undergraduate degree, mine is in psychology, a master's degree, and then a PhD in psychology. And then if you practice, you have to get a license.
Where did you get your undergraduate degree from?
I went to Missouri State University here in town.
And you say you have a master's degree?
I do.
From where?
California School of Professional Psychology.
And then your PhD?
It's from the same school.
And when did you get your PhD?
1987.
Now, what type of clinical psychology do you practice? Do you have a specific type?
I've always been a forensic psychologist.
Okay. And how does that differ from anything else? I mean, what is a clinical psychologist? I'm sorry, I'm distracted for just one moment. What is a forensic psychologist? I apologize.
Well, it's where psychology intersects with the law, where behavior intersects with the law.
And as a forensic psychologist, what kinds of evaluations would you be doing?
Mostly over the years, I've done competency to stand trial evaluations, determine whether or not someone is legally insane at the time of committing a crime, risk assessment evaluations to determine whether or not someone can be safely and effectively managed in the community, what level of structure they will require, and a lot of sex offender evaluations to determine their risk of reoffense and their diagnosis.
Do you have any idea how many of these evaluations you've conducted in the field of forensic psychology?
About 2,000 in the last 30 years.
Any idea how many of those were for the state of Missouri?
I moved to Missouri from California in 2004, and I've done sexual predator evaluations for the Attorney General's office. I probably done about 50 of those evaluations for the Missouri Attorney General, and a few evaluations for the United States Attorney on aggravated sex offender cases.
And how many do you think you've done for the criminal defense bar? Do you have any idea?
The rest of them. So, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 evaluations for defense attorneys.
Can you tell us what a CV is? What's a CV?
Curriculum vitae.
And I'm going to show you in one moment. So we get marked. But I'm going to mark as Defendant's Exhibit A. And ask you if you recognize this document. It's a multi-page document. Judge, can I approach with you?
Yes, sir.
This is my curriculum vitae.
And how many pages is that document?
It's 5.
And what all is listed in that document in terms of your experience and training and whatnot?
Well, it goes through my education and my occupational history and my presentations and publications.
Judge, I would ask that Defendant's Exhibit A be admitted in evidence.
No objection.
That we receive without objection.
Now, have you ever testified in a criminal case before?
I have,
How many times have you testified in a criminal case?
I think, about 120.
And in those 120 cases, were you ever declared an expert?
I always was.
So every time you testified in a criminal case, it was as an expert?
After I got licensed, I testified once as an intern because I was working in a forensic facility and I was not qualified then, but it was only because I wasn't licensed. After I've been licensed, I was qualified.
Judge, I would ask the court to declare him an expert witness on this issue.
On the issue of,
As a forensic psychologist. I could actually lay more foundation if you want me to.
Mr. Ashton, do you concur?
I actually don't think that's the appropriate ruling. I think you may allow him to testify as an expert. I don't think it's proper for the court to declare anyone an expert and comment on their qualifications.
I think that may be the actual methodology. But
We would ask that, Judge.
I will allow Dr. Franks to testify on the area of forensic psychology.
Are you familiar with autism?
Yes,
Tell us what autism is.
it's a neurological disorder. It's considered brain-based, and it's characterized by 2 different things. The first is impairment in social abilities, the ability to read social cues, to understand nonverbal cues, and to pick up on the appropriate emotional responses of other people. Folks with autism suffer from severe deficits in their social behavior. And then the second prong is repetitive stereotype movements. They tend to collect things, They have an insistence upon sameness. They don't like changes in their routine. Everything needs to be exactly the same. And there will be large collections, and it could be anything. It could be rocks, it could be action figures, it could be data and information. But those are the two primary characteristics.
Are you familiar with the DSM?
Yes.
What is the DSM? What does that stand for?
It's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's updated every few years, and it lists the criteria for the various mental disorders. And that's the book that we use to make diagnoses.
What is the current volume of the DSM?
5.
And in the DSM-5, is autism listed as one of the diagnoses?
It is. It's called autism spectrum disorder.
And how does autism and autism spectrum disorder differ? Or does it?
Autism spectrum disorder is the official name as it's listed in the DSM-5. Autism is more of the term that has been used over the years. The diagnosis was updated in the most recent DSM, and it was changed to autism spectrum disorder. And that's just simply what we call it now.
Are there more than one on the autism spectrum disorder? Is there more than one autism spectrum disorder?
That is the main diagnosis. There are other developmental disorders, but there's only one autism spectrum disorder. But it's considered a range. That's why they call it a spectrum. So there's cases that vary in severity. Level 1, level 2, and level 3.
That's what I was getting at, the level 3. Can you describe the 3 levels, 1, 2, and 3? Starting with the most severe.
Right. Level 1 is somebody that can function adequately with support. They need structure. They need someone to help them make decisions, adapt to social situations, and provide guidance for them. But they can function out in the world. Sometimes they can get jobs. Sometimes they can participate in higher education classes. And a lot of times they can have a family and have a life, an independent life, and function independently as long as they're getting help. Level 2 is somebody that continues to demonstrate impairment even though they're in a structured situation, even though they're getting help and someone is basically looking out for their needs, their activities of daily living, helping them with grooming, cooking, laundry, and all of those things. And despite that level of structure and help, they're still having impairment. And then level 3 is the most profound level of disorder, and that would be somebody who's characterized with severe deficits in their ability to take care of themselves, communicate, solve problems, and basically function in any meaningful way.
Do you have any experience with people with autism?
I do.
Tell us about your experience with people with autism.
Well, it wasn't added to the DSM until 1994. And so it's the disorder has been known since the 1940s. But as research has accumulated, it's become much more, clinicians are looking for it more than we used to because there's a lot more that's known about it. And so in the work that I do in evaluating people for the courts, I've learned how to administer the tests, I've learned how to identify it, and I've gone to training so that to increase my knowledge about the disorder over the last 10 years.
What challenges would children with autism typically have?
The most profound challenge is going to be interpersonal. They're going to have difficulty with making friends. They're going to have a hard time and generally be unable to establish a social niche. They're going to be the kids that don't fit in, that live on the fringes. They're oftentimes bullied. Their peers think they're weird, and they just never really fit in. And so they're solitary, and they play by themselves. And they tend to be drawn towards the television, video games, maybe animals. They get along better with things than they do with people. And so as a result of that, usually they're by themselves, and their social experiences are really negative, and so that reinforces the isolation. They get to be afraid to be around people because they'll get picked on and they're bullied and embarrassed.
What challenges do adolescents with autism spectrum disorder have as they become adults?
Well, they have many of the same challenges because when you get into high school, peer pressure is obviously very important. And so it's hard for them to find a niche, a group. Sometimes they'll associate with the kids that play video games, the gamers, and they'll be able to make some friends in that context. But essentially, they're going to be regarded as unusual, different, and a lot of times they're going to be shunned by their peer group. And so that creates a host of problems with regard to self-esteem, self-image, the way that you feel about yourself, and your confidence. You tend to withdraw and avoid social situations.
And what challenges would adults in general face who are on the autism spectrum disorder?
Well, the research has shown that when kids get out of high school, they lose that structure. So usually, these are people who are involved in special classes, behavioral classes, special education, and there's folks that are working with them and trying to help them do their schoolwork and provide structure. When they get out of high school, they lose that. And so depending upon their socioeconomic status and their cognitive abilities, a lot of times their functioning declines when they get out of high school because they don't have the help that they were having before. It depends a lot on their cognitive abilities. If they don't have a cognitive disability and their intelligence is at least average or low average, the outcomes are oftentimes better. It also depends on family support and if they have somebody that's trying to help them. If they don't, the outcomes are often negative. They have difficulty finding employment, establishing families, and oftentimes I think sort of exist on the fringes.
How could one on the autism spectrum disorder, how could it affect their decision making?
Decision making is really hard. These are folks that it's a neurological disorder, and so their ability to adapt and solve problems and think on their feet is impaired by definition. And so that's why they like routine, they like sameness, they like to collect things, because they can understand that. If they venture outside of their safety zone, they have a lot of problems, especially a stimulating, complex social environment. They're not going to do well in that situation at all.
What impairments could they face in their daily life?
It could be a range of impairment depending upon the severity of their disorder. At the mild end, it would just be difficulty connecting with people, loneliness, isolation, depression, anxiety, problems that are associated with trying to connect with other people. At the more severe end of the spectrum, they could put themselves into dangerous situations. There was a lack of reasoning, and unless someone is looking out for them, they could venture into all kinds of situations that ultimately could be dangerous or harmful for them.
We've heard some discussion of Asperger's syndrome. Tell us what that is.
Asperger's was named after the person, Dr. Asperger's, who originally identified the disorder. And it's considered the mild form of autism. It's considered a higher functioning form of autism. With Asperger's, you don't have the cognitive impairment. Their intelligence is either in the average or low average range. But there's still the social impairment. There's the difficulty connecting with people and understanding emotional give and take. And they also have the insistence on sameness and routine and the collecting behaviors. They just don't have the cognitive disability.
And do we use that term anymore?
It was removed because autism is considered a spectrum disorder. And so level 1 on the autism spectrum disorder would probably be consistent with what used to be known as Asperger's disorder.
Do you know somebody by the name of Nicholas Godejohn?
Yes.
How do you know Mr. Godejohn?
I evaluated him.
Okay. And when did you meet with him?
I saw him the first time for 7 hours at the Greene County Detention Facility on December 29, 2015. Then I saw him the second time on July 29, 2016.
And how many hours did you meet with him that time?
4 hours.
And is that unusual to meet with somebody for that long, given the kind of evaluation you're doing?
No, it's not unusual. I also interviewed his dad for an hour on the telephone.
And is that something you typically do in an evaluation, interview a family member?
It's not unusual.
Okay. Why did you do it in this case?
There is a relatives questionnaire for the autism spectrum disorder where it's a rating scale, and I wanted to administer that to his father, and so we did that over the telephone. And I also wanted to get additional background information from his father.
When you do an evaluation, is it just an interview, or is there other aspects of the evaluation?
Well, for me, I always begin with a fairly lengthy biographical interview, and I get their history. And then once that's completed, depending upon the case, I follow up with psychological testing.
And why do you get the biographical information? Why is that important?
Well, the history is what determines who we are. Our childhood is extremely important in our psychological development, and so if you understand the nature of a person's childhood, you will know a lot about why they are who they are as an adult. And then it's important to gather as much information as you can to arrive at the correct diagnosis and the correct conceptualization of the case. So you gather as much information as you can from as many sources as you can, in the hopes of developing an accurate evaluation.
Now, what kind of testing did you conduct during your evaluation of Mr. Godejohn?
I gave him an IQ test, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, 4th edition, the current one that's being used in the field. I administered the wide range achievement test to evaluate his reading, spelling, and arithmetic abilities. I used 2 personality tests. Actually, I used 3. The Rorschach Ink Blot test, the MMPI, which stands for Multiphasic Personality Inventory. And then I used an old test called the Thematic Apperception test, because it portrays interpersonal situations. And sometimes it's used in people with autism spectrum disorders to help you evaluate their understanding of people and social situations. And so,
Franks, I don't mean to interrupt you. Can you slow it down just a tad?
yes, sir.
I'm trying to keep up, and I know some of the jurors, you're using terms that may not be familiar with at all.
Understood.
Thank you.
Basically, what I wanted to say is it's an old test. I don't always use it, but sometimes it's helpful with autism spectrum disorder because you show them pictures of social situations and ask them to make up a story that goes with it. And you can get an idea of how they conceptualize social situations from what they come up with.
Now, you indicated that you did a biography of Mr. Godejohn. Is that correct?
I did. I took his history.
Can you tell us a little bit about his birth? Is there anything notable as a psychologist about his birth, or what you know about it?
His father reported to me that there was some indication his mother might have drank during the pregnancy, and there might have been some drug use. He knew about one occasion for each. The birth was complicated. She was in labor, I think for 13 hours, and the umbilical cord was wrapped around his neck. And they used a suction cup to deliver him, and the doctors told his father that his brain may have been deprived of oxygen for a period of time during the delivery because of the umbilical cord.
And when was he born?
His birth date is May 20, 1989.
Did you find anything about his family life
I did.
as he was growing up? Tell us about that.
Well, his mom and dad were married. They split up when he was about 4 years old. It was not a happy marriage. They did not get along very well. He stayed with his mother following the separation. She worked and was not very attentive to him. And so he spent a lot of time by himself. In addition to having autism spectrum disorder, he was actually physically alone for much of his childhood. And she wasn't very attentive to him, and it didn't sound like they had a very close bond. He spent some time with his father, but his mother was the custodial parent. And there were several incidents.
Your Honor, I'd object unless this is somehow going to get to his diagnosis.
Will this help us lead to your diagnosis?
I believe it will.
I'm going to allow it for the time being if we get too far afield.
You finish your thought, if you don't mind.
There was an incident where she worked as a waitress and brought home some old food, and he ate it and became really sick. And there was some evidence to suggest that she didn't take care of his medical needs the way that she should have. And then ultimately he went to live with his father when he was a teenager and came back to live with his mother when he was about 16 or 17 years old. And I think the situation was improved by that time.
What kind of educational level did he acquire?
He graduated from high school, but he was a lifelong special education student. The autism was diagnosed when he was in the second grade, and so he was in very structured classes as a result of that. And then when he was about 13 years old, they changed the diagnosis to Asperger's. But he continued to be in special education classes throughout high school.
What about his work history?
He's only had one job. He was a Social Security recipient in school by virtue of the autism. And then he worked at a pizza parlor. And he was the person that stood outside with a sign. And he did that for 13 months. They tried to have him work in a kitchen. At least that's what he told me. And he was unsuccessful. He dropped the pizza. So he only worked part-time holding a sign outside the store. And then ultimately had an interpersonal conflict with someone inside the restaurant. And afterwards, he applied for Social Security and it was granted when he was 21 years old. And so he's been on disability since that time.
Are you aware of any work skills he possesses?
None. He doesn't have any work skills.
What about his relationship history, romantic relationship history?
His father told me he had one girlfriend. He had basically one friend who suffered from an intellectual disability. And he had a sister. His sister was younger and she suffered from autism. And Nick formed a relationship with her, and that was his girlfriend for a period of months. And they had a sexual relationship. He told me that he also had a girlfriend when he was younger. His father did not confirm that. So his relationship history is extremely limited. And I think really the only confirmed romantic relationship he had was with another person who had autism.
Did you review any records as part of this evaluation?
I did.
What records did you review? If you recall.
I reviewed some school records. I reviewed his Social Security records from when he was in high school and when he was making his application to Social Security. And then they have to do yearly updates on the Social Security to maintain eligibility, and I reviewed those. And there was a disability report by Dr. Goldstein in 2010. And then, of course, I reviewed his high school records, and I reviewed the police reports and the videotapes associated with this case.
Did you speak with anybody in addition to his father and Mr. Godin as part of this evaluation?
No, not that I can recall.
Now, you indicated you met with him twice. Was there anything notable about his appearance when you met with him in your interviews?
His grooming and hygiene has always been poor. That's something that was apparent in the school records. He's always needed reminders to shower, brush his hair, and brush his teeth. And that was evident when I saw him. He has a tendency to let his beard grow out in an untrimmed manner, sometimes let his hair grow out in an untrimmed manner. So there were deficits in his grooming and hygiene consistent with his history.
Why is that important to you as a psychologist?
It shows a lack of self-care, a lack of self-management. I think it's characteristic of his disorder.
Did it change between your two interviews?
Not really. He had cut his hair the time I saw him and gained a little bit of weight when I saw him the second time, but it was still evident.
Did you note his mood?
Yes.
And tell us what you mean by when you say mood. What did you note about his mood and what is that?
He was sad, both of the times that I've seen him. It's difficult to, somebody that has autism, it's hard to assess their mood. They're not very communicative. That's part of the disorders. They don't connect with people and they don't describe themselves very well. And so it's getting a window into what his internal world is like is hard. And so as best I could determine, it's kind of sad, but his emotions are kind of flat. He doesn't show a lot of emotion. He's not real reactive in that way.
Now, you've also had an opportunity to view a video of a police interview, is that correct?
I did.
Did you notice anything about him in the police interview, aside from what he said, just his appearance, his mood?
Well, he was under a lot of stress at that point in time. I noticed he talked to himself a lot. When they were not in the room with him and he was left by himself, he talked to himself. And I thought that was sort of unusual. And then I didn't think his eye contact was very good with the officers. It wasn't very good when he was with me. And that's characteristic of autism spectrum disorder.
What is cognition?
It basically refers to the ability to think and solve problems. It's kind of synonymous with intelligence.
What about reasoning? What is that?
That's a related term. Reasoning is the ability to think through a problem, to come to a situation. There's a problem that needs to be solved, and your reasoning ability reflects your capability to solve that problem adaptively.
Did you consider his cognition and reasoning?
I'm sorry?
Did you consider his cognition and reasoning when you were evaluating him?
Absolutely.
What did you conclude?
Well, I gave him an IQ test, and he was functioning in the low average range altogether. But there's a lot of variability in his intellectual abilities. In other words, most people's intelligence is fairly consistent across different areas. There's verbal intelligence, there's the ability to work with your hands, there's memory, and then there's concentration. He had areas where he functioned fairly well, and then in other areas he functioned in a fairly poor manner.
Now, you mentioned you had him do some tests. Let's talk about some of these tests. And I wrote some of them down. Let me find where I wrote them down. Personality tests, for example. You mentioned a couple of those. Tell us what kind of personality tests. How many did you have him do?
3.
3? And they were?
The Rorschach,
Uh-huh.
the MMPI, second edition, revised, the restructured edition, MMPI 2 RF,
Okay. Is that all 3?
and the thematic apperception test.
Thematic, what's the second word?
Apperception test. They call it the TAT.
Let's start with the Rorschach. Tell us what the Rorschach test is.
Well, the Rorschach is the ink blots. It's been portrayed on television over the years. Sometimes people make fun of it. The fact of the matter is that it's a well-validated test that's been around since the 1920s. It's been administered millions of times. And there was a new scoring system that was developed based upon international norms in 2011. And one of the things that the Rorschach test does very well is measure reality testing, which is the ability to perceive your surroundings in an accurate manner. And that was the main reason that I administered it. It also provides information about a person's social understanding, their understanding of people, and the ability to interact with others in a cooperative way.
And did you come up with a result after this test?
I did.
What was your conclusion or result?
His ability to perceive reality is tenuous. He had a psychotic episode when he was 13 years old and hallucinated and talked about hearing 7 or 8 different kinds of voices. His mother in the Social Security records talked about impaired reality testing, that he had difficulty perceiving reality accurately. On the Rorschach test, you look at pictures that resemble things like a bat. And if you look at a bat and you see something else, that is impaired perception. And there was a significant amount of that, suggesting that his perception of the world around him is often inaccurate. And people usually will have human representations on the test. If you're interested in humans, you'll see humans on the ink blots. You didn't see a one. Not a fictional human, not a real human, or not a human part. Nothing. No cooperative human movement. And that suggests really deficient social understanding, deficient understanding of people, a lack of interest in people, really.
What about the MMPI test?
The MMPI test is a self-report, true-false test. There's 330 some odd items. They answer true or false to those. There are different scales that measure things like depression, anxiety, mania, paranoia, disturbed thinking, and I had him fill that out.
And did you come to any conclusions as a result of that test?
I did.
And what were those?
He reported a lot of symptoms. He was not functioning very well at the time that I saw him. He talked about having some unusual sensory and perceptual experiences at that time. He was experiencing some depression, and he was also experiencing some paranoia.
And then the third test I think you said you administered was the thematic apperception test.
Yeah.
And tell us a little bit about how you do that test.
It's as I said, it's a series of pictures that depend and ask them to make up a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end to correspond with the pictures.
And what was the result of that test?
Very primitive, very basic and concrete stories with very little understanding of the motivations of the characters. It's very simplistic.
Now, in your evaluations, and in particular your evaluation of Mr. Godejohn, do you often use proverbs to try to determine a person's thinking?
I always do.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about why you do that.
Well, there's a section called the mental status examination, and part of that section is I ask them proverbs to see if they can think abstractly. And so things like strike while the iron is hot, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, Rome wasn't built in a day, don't cry over spilled milk. And if they can provide an abstract interpretation, they're higher up the developmental ladder than somebody that interprets it concretely. And so I did that with Nick.
Do you remember which particular saying you used with Mr. Godejohn?
Can I refer to my report for this part?
Yes, and we probably ought to mark it as an exhibit if you don't mind. I'll mark it as Exhibit B.
Just for evidentiary purposes, is that correct?
Yes, just for identification purposes at this point.
So don't read it out loud, Doctor, okay? Read it to yourself.
Understood.
Okay.
See if it refreshes your recollection of
Thank you. Got it.
okay. Which particular proverbs did you use with Mr. Godejohn?
Don't cry over spilled milk. Rome wasn't built in a day, and a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush.
Let's start with the first one, don't cry over spilled milk. What was his response to that? How did he finish that particular proverb or saying?
He gave an abstract interpretation for that. He said, don't cry over a situation that isn't as big as it seems.
Okay. Did that tell you anything?
That was good. That showed some capacity for abstract thought.
Okay. I think the next one you said was Rome was not built in a day.
Yes.
How did he finish that particular one?
He told me he didn't know what that meant.
Okay. What does that tell you?
Difficulty with abstract thought.
Okay. A bird in a hand is worth two in the bush. Is that the next one?
Yes.
And how did he respond to that? Or how did he complete that?
He couldn't interpret that one either. He said he didn't know what the last two meant.
Do you use hypotheticals
I do.
in your testing?
I do.
Why?
Judgment questions. You give somebody a hypothetical scenario and ask them how they would respond to it. And it's a way of getting an idea of their judgment.
And did you use any hypotheticals in the evaluation of Mr. Godejohn?
I did.
Which ones did you use?
The first one, I use these all the time. I like them. So the first one was, you're sitting in a crowded movie theater and you're watching a movie, the place is packed, and you're the first one to see smoke and fire in the building. Well, what should you do?
Why do you ask that one?
Well, there's a right answer to it and there's a wrong answer to it. And so it's It's a way to assess judgment.
And what was his answer in the evaluation?
Probably yell fire and run out of the building.
Do you consider that to be the right answer?
No, that's the exact thing you don't want to do, because if you yell fire, you're going to create panic.
You asked him any other hypotheticals.
I did.
And what was that?
You're walking beside a lake and you see a small child playing alone, unsupervised, out at the end of a pier, next to the water. What would you do?
And what was his response to that?
His judgment was better in that situation. He said, I'd probably ask them where their parents are and contact the authorities. I'd try and find the parents of the child, maybe.
And you thought that was a better answer?
Yeah, that's basically what you're supposed to do, is make sure that the child is not unattended and get help.
Dr. Franks, earlier you mentioned the IQ test. You administered an IQ test. What is the name of the IQ test you administered?
It's called the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, 4th edition. The WEX 4.
I'm sorry, why did you use that one?
It's the standard in the field for evaluating IQ.
Tell us a little bit about the test.
It was broken up into 4 components, and they're each considered an aspect of intelligence. One is called verbal comprehension. Those are verbal tests, vocabulary, information. There's one called similarities that measures abstract reasoning. And then there's another subscale that is called perceptual reasoning. Those are tests that involve visual problems. One is putting blocks together to make geometric patterns, and then the other one is a maze test. And then there's working memory, which is the ability to hold something in memory while you perform an operation or a manipulation with it. And the last one is called processing speed, and that's the ability to process novel information and novel stimuli.
And then do you have an overall IQ that you determined from all of these?
Yes.
Let's take them one at a time. I think you mentioned verbal communication. What does that tell you as a psychologist when you look at that, when you get a score there?
Well, it's the ability to solve verbally presented problems. So some people are verbal problem solvers, some are more visual. And if they do well on the verbal, then that means that if they hear something, they're going to have a better time solving it if they score higher on the verbal subtests.
Did you get a score, a raw score, in his verbal communication?
I did.
And what is that raw score?
His index score was 96. That's based upon a standard score, and the mean would be 100. So his verbal comprehension was average.
Okay. And did you come up with a percentile?
39th percentile.
And tell us what that means so that we're all clear what you mean by 39th percentile.
That's where he would rank, with 100 being the highest. Percentile rank is based upon 0 to 100. And it's basically your place in the normative sample of people that have taken this test.
You also mentioned working memory. Tell us what that is.
Working memory is the ability to hold something in memory and perform an operation or a manipulation with it. On this test, it's measured by giving somebody a string of digits, then they have to repeat them back to you in reverse order. And then also given some random digits, and they have to sequence them from lowest to highest.
Did you come up with a score?
Yes,
What is the raw score in working memory?
77.
And did you come up with a percentile where that would rank?
Yes,
What's that?
6th.
Meaning 94% of the population would have a higher score? Is that what you're saying?
That's correct.
What about perceptual reasoning? What is that?
That's the ability to solve problems visually, sometimes with your hands, sometimes just visually.
Did you come up with a raw score there?
Yes,
And what was that?
it was 90.
What percentile would that be?
25th.
What about processing speed? What is that?
Processing speed is the ability to look at novel information and reproduce it in some manner. Integrate it and reproduce it.
Okay. Did you come up with a raw score?
I did.
What's that?
74.
What percentile would that be?
4th.
Again, 96, if I'm adding right, percent of the population would be higher.
That's right.
Did you come up with an overall IQ for Mr. Goody John?
I did.
What's that?
82.
And what percentile would that be?
12th percentile.
Now, let's talk a little bit about that overall score. Are there different categories of functioning when one has higher or lower IQs? Are there different categories?
Yes.
What are the categories?
Well, there's superior, high average, average, low average, borderline, and deficient.
And how does one fit in one of the categories? Is it based on his or her score?
Well, it would be generally based upon the full scale IQ. However, when there's so much variability or spread in the scores, sometimes the overall IQ is not the most representative score, because the person does really well on some things and poorly on others.
Is that what you noticed in this case?
Yes, a lot of variability, a lot of spread in his scores.
And what did that tell you as a psychologist?
Sometimes it's associated with neuropsychological impairment. Autism is considered a brain-based disorder, a neurological disorder, and I think that this is symptomatic of that. Working memory and processing speed are sensitive to neuropsychological impairment, and that was his poorest performance.
And where did his overall IQ rank in terms of the categories?
He would be considered low average, although processing speed and working memory were borderline.
All these scores taken together, what does that tell you about Mr. Godejohn?
Generally speaking, his overall IQ is low average. His ability to comprehend verbal information is within the average range. His visual motor problem solving is in the average range. He's going to have difficulty processing information. His memory is not very good, particularly if he has to remember something and manipulate it in some way. He's going to struggle with that.
Now, tell us what the wide range achievement test is.
It's an academic achievement test. It measures reading, spelling, and arithmetic.
Did you do that test with Mr. Godejohn?
I did.
Tell us what categories you're looking at in that test.
I administered the reading, spelling, and math computation subtests.
Tell us, how do you score that? I mean, is there a... I'll just ask you. Let's start with reading. Did you achieve a score with Mr. Godejohn on reading?
Yes.
What was that score?
His standard score was 93, based upon a mean of 100, so that's average. That's just sight reading ability, the ability to look at a word and pronounce it correctly.
And what percentage of the population would that put him in?
He was at the 32nd percentile.
What about spelling? What score did he get there?
His standard score was 102 and a percentile rank of 55.
And what about math computation?
Math was significantly lower. It was at the 75th percentile, the 75th standard score and a percentile rank of 5.
Did you do any neurological screening?
I did.
What is neurological screening?
Well, these are processing tests. They're considered screening tests. And if somebody performs in the impaired range on them, it provides some evidence that they're suffering from neuropsychological deficits.
What was the result of your visual screening test?
They were both considered processing tests, and he performed in the impaired range on both of them. His processing speed is slow, and that's evidence of neuropsychological impairment.
What about symbol digit modalities? Did you do that?
I did.
And what did you find there?
He was beneath the 10th percentile. His processing speed is slow.
Now, you talked a little bit about having evaluated him. Did you draw any conclusions about Mr. Godejohn and as it relates to DSM-5, where he may be on that?
Yes.
What did you conclude?
He has an autism spectrum disorder. I also administered an autism quotient test, and he was positive on that. And it supported the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, and in my opinion, it was at the level 2.
Is that consistent with his earlier diagnosis?
It's consistent with his school records, his Social Security records, and an evaluation that was performed by Dr. Goldstein in 2010.
Do you have testing that you do to help determine this?
Yeah, the autism?
Yes.
Yes.
And what kind of testing do you do? What is it called, first of all?
I use the autism quotient, and it's based upon 3 tests. The first is an autism questionnaire, and it's basic autism questions about primarily social behavior and collecting behavior. There's a second test that's called the empathy quotient. People who suffer from autism have deficits in empathy. It's called the theory of the mind. They have difficulty understanding other people's points of view. They cannot put themselves in someone else's shoes. The empathy quotient helps measure that. And then the third is the relatives questionnaire, and I administered that with his dad over the telephone.
Do you score these things?
Yes.
Okay. And how do you score the first one, the autism questionnaire?
Well, I have a spreadsheet, and type in the scores. I had him fill them out on a form, and then I entered them into the spreadsheet, and the computer scored it.
Okay. Did you come up with a score?
I did.
Tell us what the score is, and we'll talk a little bit about that.
On the autism spectrum quotient, the AQ, he scored 30.
What does that mean to you? Because it probably doesn't mean much to any of us, since we don't really understand it, but what does it mean to you?
It's in the high range. Most people with autism spectrum disorders score around 32, according to the research on this scale. He scored at 30, and it would be considered a high score. He's endorsing a lot of symptoms of autistic spectrum disorder.
What about the empathy quotient? What kind of score did you get on that?
He obtained a score of 27.
What does that tell you?
Again, that was in the impaired range. He showed significant deficits in empathy, or the ability to understand other people and put himself in their shoes and understand others, their emotional perspectives, empathy. He's deficient in that.
In the relatives questionnaire, what did that tell you? Because that I assume you were talking to a third person, right?
His father. His father reported he had a lot of autistic symptoms. He had difficulty forming relationships with peers. There was some rocking behavior, a little bit of head banging behavior as a kid. He would bang his head against walls while he rocked. He collected things like rocks, action figures. Very little peer development while he was growing up. He never formed a social niche. He was solitary. And the relatives questionnaire was positive for autism spectrum disorder. All 3 of these were.
Overall, what do these tests tell you about Nicholas Godejohn?
That he has an autism spectrum disorder. Characterized by severe deficits in social understanding, social reciprocity, understanding nonverbal cues, understanding emotions, and then an insistence on sameness, inability to venture outside of his house, and the collective behaviors that's characteristic of the disorder.
And did you draw an ultimate conclusion regarding, to a reasonable degree of psychological certainty, what did you diagnose Mr. Godejohn with?
Autism spectrum disorder, level 2.
Anything else that you added to that?
No.
Anything about support?
Requiring substantial support with accompanying intellectual impairment.
And was that part of your diagnosis?
Yes.
What does that mean, requiring substantial support with accompanying intellectual impairment?
It's a specifier in the DSM-5. It means that he requires substantial support in order to be able to function adequately. He needs supervision and he needs structure, or he could pose a danger to himself or others.
One second. Judge, can we make a brief record if you don't mind? Yes, sir. Of course.
Thank you very much. Good job. And Mr. Perry, you might reference the specific document. You must not discuss this case among yourselves or with others, or permit anyone to discuss it in your hearing. You should not form or express any opinion about the case until it is finally given to you to decide. Do not do any research or investigation on your own about any matter regarding this case or anyone involved with the trial. Do not communicate with others about the case by any means. Do not read, view, or listen to any newspaper, radio, electronic communication from the internet or television report of the trial. It's 2:48. Why don't we recess till about 5 after 3, and we'll come back and continue the topic.
All rise.